Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is re-elected as leader of the ruling ANC party, stepping out from the shadow cast by a cover-up scandal that had dogged his campaign. Also, we did it. As some hail the COP15 biodiversity summit's deal to protect nature, Congo argues that it doesn't go far enough in supporting conservation efforts in developing countries. I also speak to one Senegalese doctor who's concerned about the agreement's limited protection for indigenous rights. And Kigali says it's a positive step that has been taken towards solving the global migration crisis after the UK's High Court rules that its government can legally send asylum seekers on a one-way trip to Rwanda. But first, South Africa's rand jumped on Monday on news that President Cyril Ramaphosa had been re-elected as the leader of the ruling ANC party. He beat former Health Minister Zweli Mkhize to secure a second five-year term and paved the way for him to contest the presidency again at 2024 elections. His victory comes despite a campaign that was dogged by what was called the Farmgate scandal. Nadine Thero has more.
President Cyril Ramaphosa will continue leading the African National Congress and by default South Africa for now. ANC members voted him in for another term at the party's national conference in Johannesburg on the weekend. This gives the party a much better chance of remaining in power after the 2024 elections. Its support plummeted over the last decade. Under former President Jacob Zuma, its leadership has been plagued by corruption, costing the country around €3 billion. But Ramaphosa himself is still being investigated for an alleged cover-up of the theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars in foreign currency from his game farm, Phala Phala.
It is a really, really big problem for the president. I think, as you will remember, the Justice Nkobo, we investigated him in terms of Section 89 of the Constitution, found that he has something to explain to Parliament. He's been saved and protected by his own party in the parliamentary process. But now the National Prosecuting Authority will ask exactly the same question. To what extent has the president not only not complied with the PRECA Act by not reporting the crime to the Hawks as the law stipulate, but also to what extent has the president since then tried to hide or cover up the whatever has happened on the farm on Christmas Day in 2019. Now, I think those events, as I explained them, has a very specific bearing on the credibility of the president, not only as president of the ANC, but also as president of South Africa.
If Ramaphosa is found guilty of corruption, he will be forced to resign by his own party. Ironically, because of the anti-corruption rules he implemented when he took over from Jacob Zuma.
Nadine Thero there for us. Now, the deal to protect 30% of the planet by 2030, thrashed out by the COP15 biodiversity summit in Montreal, has been hailed as an historic step by many international organisations, despite Congo arguing that developed nations should provide more resources to poorer countries to roll back habitat destruction. Now, some conservationists have also said that the text was a mixed bag. I'm joined now by Dr. Abi Sene, a researcher in conservation social science, who says that the deal pulls its punches when it comes to safeguarding the rights of indigenous people as stewards of their own lands. Doctor, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, first of all, just explain what indigenous rights have got to do with conservation.
Sure. Well, there's several reasons why indigenous land rights are central to global conservation. First, it's not coincidental that much of the lands targeted for conservation are in indigenous territories. Land, especially in the Congo River Basin in Africa, for example, are some of the most biodiverse because indigenous and local people have stewarded those landscapes for millennials, right? And so there's ample evidence that indigenous natural resource management system protect and enrich biodiversity in those lands. Second, it is also estimated that up to 80% of existing protected areas overlap with land indigenous people and people of African descent inhabit and manage. And their livelihood and culture of those communities are directly tied to their ancestral lands. And so they have a vested interest in protecting those ecosystems against extractive and exploitative activities from corporations. And so all evidence point to the reality that indigenous and local communities are the best custodians of those lands targeted for conservation. And we cannot address this ecological crisis without the robust protection of the land rights and sovereignty of those indigenous people.
So what were you hoping to see from COP15? Why was that the right forum to have this issue of indigenous rights specifically mentioned?
Sure, absolutely, because COP15 is where the 30 by 30 plan, which is also known as the Global Biodiversity Framework, was negotiated. And the plan intends to expand the coverage of conservation areas for biodiversity from 17 to 30% by 2030. This framework sets the standard for how global biodiversity is going to be achieved and implemented. So conservation has a long history of human rights violations where indigenous communities are tortured and forcibly evicted from those lands to create protected or conservation areas like national parks and nature reserve. And so many fear that this plan will lead to further violence. And so the ongoing evictions of the Maasai people today in Tanzania, in Loliondo, is to expand the conservation area is an example of the kinds of indigenous rights violation that can take place under this new COP15 agreement that was passed last night. And so another issue too is that even though protected areas are created for the protection of biodiversity, extractive activities like mining, logging, biofuel plantations on these lands are happening at an alarming rate. And the Rainforest Foundation has documented concession issues to extractive corporations. And some of the most documented concessions are also in the drcongo. But there are also lesser known cases in other African countries, like in my home country of Senegal, where the government issued a mining concession to Petowal Mining Company in the south of Nyokolokoba National Park in 2016.
Abby?
And so if the agreement out of COP15 doesn't make robust provision to protect local community land rights, it leaves the door open not only for human rights violation, but also for more extractive and ecologically damaging activities in conservation areas.
Thank you.
And so, sure.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, Dr. Abby Seni. Thank you so much for giving us that insight into the important link between indigenous rights, the link of indigenous communities to their land, and global efforts to boost conservation.
Thank you.
Now, seeing with the idea of the importance of indigenous people and their relationship with the land, they're often recognised as the world's top conservationists and protectors of biodiversity. In one reserve that straddles Togo and Benin, traditional symbols of religious protection are being used to change local behaviours and roll back the destruction of mangroves. Our team sent us this report.
In southwestern Benin, Vodun devotees often place representations of sacred deities in places they want to protect. The effigies are meant to keep people away. One NGO has harnessed this tradition to help slow down the destruction of the Bouches du Roi conservation area, where biodiversity is in danger.
The population here is a population of fishermen, and it was necessary to smoke the fish before selling it. So the women would cut the mangrove wood to smoke it and sell it. The women would also cut the mangrove to prepare the salt. And so these practices have seriously degraded the mangrove.
Marine life is abundant, but between man's overexploitation and the effects of climate change, today 30% of the mangrove has disappeared. For the last 6 years, Vodun chiefs and local leaders have been working together to try to turn the tide.
We monitor the mangrove all the time because we know that it protects our coast from coastal erosion and protects our villages. It limits the effects of flooding. It also allows migratory birds to come and lay their eggs.
17 villages between Grand Popo and Kome have been working together, and so far 15 sacred figurines have been placed around the region as a reminder to locals to respect a delicate ecological balance. This area is protected by a deity which is known to inspire fear. So far, the figurines have only been placed across about 10% of the mangroves, but locals say they're already making a difference. On this sacred island, migratory birds are back after years of reforestation efforts. Conservationists are aiming to restore another 3,500 hectares of vital mangroves to the state they were in 30 years ago.
The UK's High Court has ruled that its government can legally send asylum seekers on a one-way trip to Rwanda. Kigali's called the decision a positive step in finding long-term solutions to the global migration crisis, and Denmark is also considering concluding such an agreement with Rwanda. And Tunisia's electoral board has slightly revised the turnout to Saturday's parliamentary elections to 11.2% from the 8.8% of the electorate initially said to have turned up. Most political parties had boycotted the vote, condemning it as a charade aimed at shoring up President Kais Saied's power grab last year. His critics continue to call for him to step down. Caroline Lamboulé has more.
It was the lowest turnout since the 2011 Tunisian revolution. Most political parties boycotted the polls. For many, the results send a clear message to President Kais Saied.
I boycotted the polls. When you vote, it's taking a stand. When you submit a blank vote, it's taking a stand. And when you boycott, it's also taking a stand. If we look at the abstention rate, you understand that it's a strong message from society and the people to the authors of this process and this project.
The president has slowly consolidated his grip on power since he was elected in 2019 with 70% of the vote. In 2022, he dissolved the parliament, cutting short its 5-year term. Over the summer, despite pushback and protests, he pushed through a new constitution that further consolidated his powers. It was approved in a referendum which saw a 27% turnout, the lowest until the latest polls. Several major parties have said this weekend's record low turnout means Saied's time is up.
The
Electoral Commission says there was an 8.8% turnout. This is the equivalent of an 8.8 magnitude earthquake on the Richter scale.
Only 21 candidates secured a seat in the first round. A runoff is expected early next year.
Well, thanks for staying with us. That's it for Eye on Africa. Stay with us, more coming up after a short break. Take care.